We are ready to start. Yes. Okay, thank you everybody for being here, and welcome to the sponsor symposium on the importance of understanding diet and food affordability for food resilience and food security. My name is Wendy Gonzalez. I'm a senior technical specialist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition Gain, and I'll be co-moderating this session with Saskia the TP from World Food Program. She'll begin by providing a brief overview of the topic of affordability. Then we'll move on to a presentation from Rachel Gilbert from the Tufts University, who will share some insights from global and subnational monitoring on affordability of diets. Then we'll move on to the presentation of Lily Schofield from Save the Children, who will discuss the impact of COVID, climate, and conflict on diet affordability and value of routine monitoring. Following, Sabrina Curie from the World Food Program will discuss the use of cost and affordability of nutritious and healthy diet metrics to inform tailored strategies for improving diets. And finally, Florencia Basta from GAIN will discuss the role of fortification in improving affordability of foods.
Good afternoon and welcome to this session. Very nice to see you here. I'm really excited about this session. Well, I'm Saskia de P with the World Food Program, leading the Analytics and Science for Food and Nutrition team. So in this session, we will review the use of cost and affordability metrics. These have been in use for about 15 years. We're seeing a really good uptake of these metrics to inform global comparisons between countries and to have an indication of the extent to which food environments provide for diets that are adequately nutritious and adequately diverse for our food, for a healthy diet based on food-based dietary guidelines. And we'll hear from the different presenters how these metrics are constituted and how they are being used, both at a global level as well as in country. So it's really exciting to have such a good group of presenters. We'll have each presenter present for around 15 minutes, then we'll take questions just for clarification. Then we'll go to the next presenter, and then we'll have a broader discussion at the end. So most welcome to people who are entering the room. Please take your seat, and I invite the first speaker, Rachel.
This is an interestingly high podium. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Gilbert. I'm presenting on behalf of Tufts University, the Food Prices for Nutrition project. Apologies to some of you who were just in the last session, which also covered affordability. I will be covering very similar material on behalf of the Food Prices for Nutrition project, but I spoke quickly then, so hopefully I can slow it down this time, get some new information in. But today what I want to talk about again is affordability of healthy diets and the insights from global and subnational monitoring from the Food Prices for Nutrition project. So let's see. Okay, so we know from the global monitoring that many consumers cannot access healthy diets. And we know this from new data that's just come from the Food Prices for Nutrition project, which is a collaboration between the International Food Policy Research Institute and the World Bank, a project that began actually back in 2015 with other researchers on different projects and has been a collaboration with many other individuals, some in the room. And what these data do is to measure physical and economic access to healthy diets. So we've come up with a practical metric to assess food security based on the official UN definition, which we've had for many years now, physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet dietary needs. So we're finally able to incorporate that dietary needs component by looking at a whole healthy diet. And this data is being used now by the United Nations. It's being monitored every year in the flagship report, the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, or the SOFIA report. So you may be familiar with some of these metrics. And the core of these metrics is that we're using retail food prices to identify the least expensive combination of locally available foods in the quantities that are needed for health. So key here is that we're looking at least cost diets as a benchmark for what it would take for people to be able to afford these diets. So joining these other measures of food security, we're moving beyond just calories, for example, in the prevalence of undernourishment, or the things that people regularly eat in the food insecurity experience scale, and going to what people should eat. And when I say what people should eat, I'm talking about what is outlined in food-based dietary guidelines. So many countries have their own national food-based dietary guidelines, which help people consume and select a nutrient-adequate diet and go beyond just the nutrients. But what we're doing is we're using those food-based dietary guidelines and selecting the least cost items in the quantities needed to achieve those goals. And retail foods, we're using these retail prices, so we're really focused on a market level metric. And I want to point out that in the SOFI, if those of you who are familiar, we have 3 different types of least cost diets that help you see this ladder of affordability, help you understand why people have trouble improving diets based on the cost of these diets. So at the base here, we have the least cost diet that meets only energy needs. So the basic starchy staple cost to meet daily energy needs on a global average basis in 2017. This is using food price data from the only global retail food price data set. That's from the International Comparison Program at the World Bank. The average price per day was about 83 cents just to meet calorie needs. Now, if you want to improve it to achieve nutrient adequacy, so you're within the upper and lower bounds of nutrient needs, it's an additional cost of up to $2.46 per person per day. So the global poverty line is around $2.15. You can see that getting to that nutrient adequacy, again, this is the global average in 2017, is already more than most people can afford. Now, achieving healthy diets that meet national food-based dietary guidelines, which move beyond just nutrient needs, but to incorporate diversity within and across food groups, it's more expensive again. So up to $3.31 per day on average globally. And we know that from this ladder of affordability, it helps you think through the things that impede people from eating healthy diets. But then, of course, we know that there is a lot of food spending that goes above and beyond these levels. So the global average food spending in 2017 was about $5.46 per day. Again, huge variation globally in what food spending actually looks like. But we know that people often spend more, they can afford a healthy diet, and they spend more than it would cost to achieve a healthy diet, and yet don't necessarily eat a healthy diet. Because in here, people are achieving other goals. So they may be achieving convenience goals or preferences. And so this ladder of affordability helps us understand that healthy diets are often out of reach, but there are other preferences and other things that people are trying to achieve that keep us from achieving healthy diets. So the metrics, the cost and affordability of a healthy diet, which are, again, being monitored globally by the World Bank and FAO, can help us diagnose causes of poor nutrition and help to guide investments. So when we see, again, these are least cost diets, so this is a benchmark diet, it's the least expensive way to meet the guideline that we're discussing. Where prices for least cost items are high, we can identify innovations or investments in distributing and providing foods at lower cost. Where people don't have enough income available to buy food, it might be a place to look for employment that can increase people's income, safety nets, social protection systems to raise affordability. Then there are places where people could afford a healthy diet but do not. And so then there's the need to address what are those barriers that keep people from eating a healthy diet. In some cases, it may be that there are a lot of meal preparation costs, or there are time costs, or there are other things that are keeping people from purchasing those healthy foods or consuming those healthy foods. Or it may be about food choice. It may be that there's either just innate preferences that people have, or that there are aspects of the food environment that are pushing people towards unhealthy foods. So these are ways that we can use the diet cost and affordability metrics to understand what are the points for intervention here. If people can't afford a healthy diet, it may not make sense to put a lot of money into a nutrition behavior change intervention. So we can also analyze variations in the cost and affordability over time and over different areas to help guide policy. So I want to just outline what is included in a least cost diet, give you a picture of a couple of countries. The foods that are selected here, again, are the least expensive items being sold at any time and place. So on the global level, we're talking about a national average price in 2017. And each set of items is 11 items across 6 food groups. So what we do is we use basically a least common denominator across many national food-based dietary guidelines worldwide. It's called the Healthy Diet Basket for the global monitoring purposes. And you can see here that we have starchy staples, legumes, nuts and seeds, oils and fats, etc., in different proportions. So what stays constant in the monitoring is that the same proportion of calories and the same number of items are selected in each time and place, but the items change based on their cost and based on the geographic location. So for Pakistan in 2017, the cost was $3.41 per day. Hopefully you can see it up there. So you can see that the least cost items in Pakistan in 2017, we had wheat flour and maize as the starchy staples, accounting for about 12% of the entire healthy diet. Just directly to the left, you can see that the animal source foods here accounted for 29% of the cost of a healthy diet. So these least cost items were buffalo milk and live chicken. And then you can see fruits and vegetables, when combined, are even larger than the cost of the animal source foods. So this helps also to identify which foods and which food groups are most expensive and most difficult for people to achieve within a healthy diet. And as a comparison here, we also have Senegal. So you can see how the items change based on the location. In Senegal, the cost for animal source foods is much lower, relatively speaking. It's 16% of the total cost of a healthy diet, with sardines and small dried fish as the animal source foods selected. So what you can see is that the items here are selected to reflect local availability of foods and the cost of foods in different places, but underlying the same balance in food groups across all of those locations. So all of these are, again, benchmark costs that are based on a national average price. So this is a very high-level view of a food system, but this is what's used for the global monitoring. And these are in purchasing power parity terms. So we're adjusting for the total cost, the cost of other goods and services in the economy as well. So what have we discovered globally about the cost of and affordability of healthy diets from this monitoring? Well, you can see here in this figure, we have on the on the y-axis there, we have the cost per day, again, at purchasing power parity prices to compare across all of these countries. And you can see we have income levels on the bottom. So what you find in this figure is that food costs differ but are not lower in low-income countries, which I think is a slightly surprising finding if you think about it. We're comparing in real terms compared, again, to all of their services. But it is shocking that it's perceived that there's a discount, I think, in low-income countries, that foods might be cheaper there, and that's not the case, as we see from this monitoring. The other important thing is that least cost healthy diets are unaffordable for the poor. So you may have heard the headline number from the SOFI, which is that about 3 billion people cannot afford even the least cost healthy diet. And then there are still people, as you can see from the figure, that can't even afford a energy sufficient diet, a calorie adequate diet. So in this figure, we've just added in the actual spending from countries. So you can see those same diets. You can see the same diets as in the previous figure, but now we've added in actual food spending. with these little black X's, and you can see that actual food spending is much lower than the healthy diet cost in low-income countries. And as you go across the income spectrum, it appears that food spending is much greater than least cost healthy diets in middle and high income countries. Of course, these X's represent average food spending in each of these countries, so there's a lot of variation, and there are still many people and many households in these countries that can't afford a healthy diet. So these are things that we would want to look at a subnational level to understand what's the variation within country. So when we do subnational monitoring, which is an important part of the Food Prices for Nutrition project, is trying to use existing data to monitor this, not just at the global level. The global monitoring is very interesting, very important for understanding the big picture and understanding how things compare across regions, but we know that one national average price is not really sufficient to understand how can we intervene. And so most countries in the world collect their own retail food price data for the purposes of monitoring inflation. And so there's very, very rich data sets that are collected on a monthly basis in almost all countries. And these data can be harnessed for understanding nutrition, for calculating least cost diets. So we are working on this with national statistical offices in some countries as well as with other partner government institutions. So for example, in Ethiopia, we are working with the Ethiopian Statistical Service and the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, with support from IFPRI and NIPIN, to monitor the cost of a healthy diet. So on a quarterly basis, what we can look at is, this is actually based on Ethiopia's own food-based dietary guidelines, which are relatively new. And what we can see is that across regions, there's quite a lot of variation in the cost of a healthy diet. And you can see from the different colors of those bars, those are different food group costs, that there's also differences in food group costs. So we want to understand, for example, if food group costs in one location are much lower and much higher in another place that's just nearby, we can start to think about what are the constraints in making those foods available just in the region next door, or things like that. This is sort of a good way of a diagnostic tool to think about what improvements can be made. And in Nigeria, we're working towards using the national inflation data. Previous work was done with a household survey to understand the cost of a healthy diet, and this is on the food systems dashboard. And I'm highlighting this because here's the cost, a map of the cost per day, where the darker colors represent a higher cost. But when you juxtapose that with an affordability assessment, the colors completely switch. So the places that have really high costs also happen to have fairly high affordability, because those places also have high incomes and people that can afford that high cost. So the monitoring at the local level or at the subnational level can really help us understand what are the places to target, what places need innovations to distribute food better, to supply food better, or where there are places where people's incomes are too low to support, to purchase these healthy diets. So in summary, the cost and affordability of healthy diets, which is a global food security metric now, is a useful new metric for identifying places for intervention to improve diet quality. So we know that there are about 3 billion people, that's about 40% of the global population, for whom healthy diets are still unaffordable. So the first thing to do is to alleviate that affordability barrier. We can think about different ways to do that, but then there's many people for whom the cost is not the issue necessarily, it's the income, and so that's another point of intervention. And for those globally who can afford a healthy diet but choose not to, there's another set of interventions related to behavior change or the food environment or other things that influence choice. Really important frontiers for future work on this, building off of what's been done for the monitoring globally, is to identify other costs that affect why people choose certain diets, particularly the cost of time use and meal preparation and the role of non-food factors in these diet choices. And we're excited to continue working on these frontiers and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Oh, let me just...
I think a few key takeaways there. One is that this indicator allows to measure nutrition within the food security metric. So it's really cost and affordability of diets that meet energy needs, nutrient needs, and diversity. So it's really capturing all. And knowing that picture from Nigeria where you show the cost and then you show the affordability, that of course how much people can actually spend on food drives the affordability. This metric is what's published in the SOFI report as the cost of the healthy diet based on the food-based dietary guidelines. And it's actually a global guidance or a global way of arriving at the metric which reflects different food-based dietary guidelines. And also really to note that the cost of healthy and the cost of nutrient adequate, they were both substantially above the cost of an energy-only diet. So yeah, thank you very much. We have some time for some clarifying questions. We're not seeing any online at the moment. If there's anyone in the room who has a clarifying question, we invite you to come to the microphone. It'll be very clear, Rachel. So then we invite Lily.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to take you from the global level to the very micro, kind of local level, and looking at some work that Save the Children's been doing with our cost of the diet tool to look at kind of monitoring impacts of some of these polycrises we've heard a lot about this week so far, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about, of climate, COVID, and conflict. So just briefly, I don't really have time within this presentation to spend a lot of time on kind of the cost of the diet, but it's another metric of how we kind of look at cost-driven models of diet. It's both a method and a software that's been developed by Save the Children kind of starting back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it's gone through several different iterations. But it estimates the lowest cost at the lowest cost, the quantity and combination of locally available foods that are needed to provide a typical family or individual with their energy, protein, fat, and micronutrient intakes for 13 different micronutrients. This is a schema of the type of information it combines. It uses a linear program to combine all of these information and generate hypothetical diets that meet the specifications at the lowest possible cost. And when we include income and expenditure data, we can then look at affordability, and we can change those parameters to model different interventions and see the impact of those interventions on that affordability. So it's a very useful tool to also assess potential interventions. And just lastly, if you want more information or you want to read about it or have a download and a play of the new version of the software that we've just launched, that's where you can find it. And it's an open source software. So typically cost of the diets are quite large scale primary data collection exercises where we go out, we collect a bunch of market information within a local area, a livelihood zone or a district to find out what foods are available and what do they cost. And then we enter that information. So it takes a fair bit of resource and time. We might do it at the beginning of a project or the beginning and the end of a project, but we're not doing it on a very regular basis. However, when the COVID-19 pandemic began unfolding across the world, we were seeing that the impacts of the pandemic were kind of affecting markets directly through restricted movements, curfews, and other disruptions to markets. Also, people were less able to go out and earn incomes and do their livelihoods in the way that they normally would. There were border closures that affected the movement of food and the trade of other goods, and food price increases. So we're very interested to see, can we use cost of the diet and another tool that SAVE uses quite a lot called the household economy analysis to better understand the impact of COVID-19 and the associated restrictions on access and affordability. So we got a small amount of money. We're trying to rapidly deploy a pilot. So we found, as you do, 2 programs that we could kind of bolt this onto. One in Niger, in Zindera region, and the other in Malawi, in 2 different livelihood zones. So you can see the small red circles are showing you kind of where in the country. So these are kind of quite granular areas, looking at particular livelihood zones. And we modified how we normally approach this. So because we wanted to get really frequent data, we looked at a shortened food list. So in Niger, we didn't kind of have good secondary data on price that kind of provided enough variation in the types of foods. So we took a food list from an old cost of the diet, we shortened it, we focused on kind of the 20 key foods, and we collected price information on those foods, both retrospectively from January to October, and then in real time from November to April. And we adjusted those for kind of the regular consumption of the staples, so millet and sorghum in that case. In Malawi, there is a minimum expenditure basket monitoring at a national level that collects from a sample of markets across the country. So we were able to use that data, and we extracted the data for the 5 markets in the area we were interested in, and looked at that across the same time period. And for the HEA, we focused on those livelihood parameters that would be most relevant for the poorest, and also most affected by change month to month. So those livelihood strategies that they would vary month to month. And we collected information on how people were changing those through focus group discussions. So what did we see? This is the data from Niger. So this is showing the total weekly cost of a nutritious diet adjusted for kind of food habits from January of 2020 till April of 2021. And you can see, the first thing we see is that there's kind of a natural seasonal peak in the overall cost, kind of towards the end of the lean season in 2020. And then the prices then come back down in September and October. This is when the harvest starts to come in for a couple of the key staples. However, what we saw in 2021, in the beginning of 2021, was actually a really strong increase in prices that wasn't seasonal, and actually exceeded the seasonal peak of the previous year. Now, this coincided with a period of kind of both increasing COVID restrictions and also closure of the border with Nigeria, which was a key trade partner for this part of Niger, due to some conflict in the area. So this was kind of showing the impacts of that on the food price faced by people in this area. When we combine that with information about people's incomes, what you can see here in the lower graph, I'll focus for time reasons, is the comparison of affordability across 2 years. So the darker blue represents the 2019-2020 production year, and the lighter blue represents 2020-2021. And it's represented as a proportion of household income. So you can see that in October of the 2 years, a very similar affordability gap of about 120%. So how poor households needed 120% of their income to afford nutritious diet and their kind of key non-food expenditures. However, in January, February, March, we see that that affordability gap really increased in the second year. So while in the first year it was around 110% in those months, it increased to up to 160% in April. And so that was showing a combination of both increasing prices, which we saw in the previous graph, and also a reduction in incomes. We looked at the same information for Malawi, again using a slightly different data source, in this case secondary data. Again, we see some kind of seasonal trends in this area, though it's less distinct than what we saw in Niger. But what's interesting here is that we saw quite a large increase in cowpeas, which was a key protein source in this diet, towards the latter half of our monitoring period. And that meant that actually the software replaced those cowpeas with eggs. So you can see the teal bar in the top graph is really expanded in those later months. And that's because the cowpeas actually increased by about 42% in price and then became too expensive. So it was cheaper to actually use eggs for that protein source. So again, and the other thing that was interesting here is while we were seeing overall some price increases across our monitoring period, this was actually a period where maize price, the staple food, was quite low compared to previous years. So it was below the 2019 prices in 2020 and 2021 because of quite bumper crop harvest. So again, just highlighting that national level prices might not reflect at the local level, and also that there's other kind of key drivers of overall affordability of nutritious diets. So we ended our pilot in May of 2021. We ran out of our funding finished, but we were really keen to continue to use this real-time data monitoring and help it to inform program design. And we were lucky enough to receive funding for a project in Malawi called the Maziko Project, which is a multi-sectoral nutrition program And a component of that project, which is funded by the Power of Nutrition and other donors, is a cash transfer, a social transfer aimed at improving infant and young child feeding in the first 1,000 days. So we wanted to then use this affordability analysis to help us design that transfer. So this is just showing data from the Malawi Poverty Report in 2020. This is the income data that we used as a basis for our analysis, because we looked at both within our programming areas, but also at a national level to design our cash transfer. And you can see the income varies from about 600 USD per year for the ultra poor up to about 2,400 for urban households. And as a reference, we looked at a 5-member household. So this is the household composition that we looked at as our reference, as this kind of represented an average household size in Malawi. So the data I'm going to present is based off of that household. So when we looked at affordability based off of that analysis from 2021 to 2022, we could see that ultra-poor households faced an affordability gap of about 240% of their income to afford food and essential non-food expenditure. And that basically all households except for the urban faced some level of affordability gap. When we quantified that, it works out to about 30 USD per month for the poor and 50 USD per month for the ultra poor to be able to afford that nutritious diet. And as I said, we're particularly interested in pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, and young children. So we also use this data to say, okay, what's the actual cost across that a 30-month window of the first 1,000 days of life? We left off the first trimester because practically it's very hard to target a woman the minute she falls pregnant. So typically we don't pick them up in a program until they're in their second trimester. So you can see that overall it costs about 800 USD at the time that we did this analysis for a mother-child pair to afford and access a nutritious diet in Malawi. That works out to about 27 USD per month if you average that across the 30 months. So based on this, we explored 2 different potential transfer values and modeled that and explored that with stakeholders. So this is showing the household affordability analysis when we did a $20 per month transfer and a $35 per month transfer. And you can see that while both levels had an impact on the household affordability, neither level kind of fully closed the affordability gap at a household level, though the $35 per month did cover the full cost for that mother-child dyad at different levels. For the average household overall, we were able to actually close the affordability gap at the $35 per month level, but for the 2 poorest groups, they still faced some affordability gap. Now, this isn't the only metric when you're trying to set a transfer value. There is also, government, stakeholders, and what could potentially be scalable and affordable. So there was a lot of consultation back and forth, and also you're obviously constrained by what resources you have in your program budget. So finally, what was agreed within the program is that they're going to actually test 2 different levels of transfer. One at the higher end of $43 per month for 30 months, and one at the lower end at $17 per month. And this is part of an ongoing program evaluation to see kind of the differential impacts of these 2 levels of cash transfer. And so this was kind of set and is a running program. We're hoping to start the midterm evaluation of this in a few months, or no, next month even. So we'll have kind of some preliminary data on what we're seeing in these 2 groups, hopefully by early 2024. But obviously, affordability isn't static and isn't fixed. So we did this analysis when we were designing the transfer, but obviously the price data has continued. So this is actually an extension of that affordability analysis. It's preliminary because we don't have fully updated income figures. So a caveat to this is the income figures we use for this are slightly older. But what we can see is that since middle of kind of 2022, we've actually seen a really big increase in the affordability gap. So when we did our initial analysis, we had a 240% affordability gap for the ultra poor. That's increased upwards of 400%. So I think one of the key things we need to learn in our midterm is also what is that affordability gap increase, what impact has that had on the effectiveness of our cash transfers? So kind of in summary, as would probably surprise no one, COVID, climate, and conflict are driving increases in the cost of nutritious diets, and affordability is worsening. Regular monitoring at local levels really provides important information on barriers that households can face, and also helping to design interventions, and also understanding things that might erode the effectiveness of those interventions. And designing social assistance should be informed by affordability analysis, as well as other factors. And lastly, kind of way forward, as I mentioned, we are testing these cash transfers that I went through, and we'll be learning more about them in our midterm later this year, and also the overall RCT will be wrapping up in 2025. But another area that we're really interested in is on predictive models. So recognizing climate shocks are increasing in severity and frequency, and a key area of work that Save the Children is interested in is on anticipatory action and being able to respond before shocks occur and provide households with support before that happens. So can we include affordability into those predictive models, and how is a kind of key area of interest for us. And lastly, kind of in general, expanding access to regular localized data. So oftentimes we find that the price monitoring may not have enough diversity of foods, or may be at kind of a relatively high level in terms of regional or national markets. So having more localized data can be put to use in these ways. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lily. And so these are linearly optimized diets that meet nutrient needs. So slight contrast, slight difference with what Rachel presented. So Rachel looked at cost, how do you call it? Cost
of a healthy diet, yeah.
Yeah, cost of a healthy diet, and you achieve it not by linear optimization, but by
optimization.
non-linearly optimized, so the selection of the lowest cost foods in the food group. While the nutritious diet is linearly optimized, so the selection of foods that you get doesn't necessarily make for nice recipes. And that's also why you showed the food habits diet, which takes more into consideration what are choices that people tend to make, and therefore what's a more realistic cost picture. Also good for us to hear that Save the Children started the work on the cost of the diet software back in the late 90s, so about 25 years from then. It's gone through different phases, and good to hear that the new version is now up and running. So there's different softwares that are being used, and it was also interesting to see how you used the food list from a previous cost of the diet to go back and be able to work with a shorter food list with foods that you had previously identified. And many thanks for showing the example from the application with COVID-19 and with the monitoring data. I mean, you could clearly see how the cost increased and how the non-affordability increased. So if there's any clarifying question, please. We're not seeing any clarifying questions online. Anyone from the floor? Yeah, please. There's a mic just next to you. Oh, sorry, could you use the microphone for the people online? Mm-hmm. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for the two presentations, really interesting. My name is Flaminia Ortensi and I work for GAIN. So my question is not really a clarifying question, it's more of an overall question and also maybe a comment. So I've been working with Rachel and a team at GAIN on the cost of a healthy diet and an application to some of our countries with certain target foods that we are working with. And I wanted to hear from you, there are lots of tools out there and lots of methods to calculate the affordability of healthy diets, and all of them are different and could be applied in different contexts and for different purposes. Do you think that it would be helpful to somehow put together, I don't know, guidelines or standardize the various tools that exist out there and specify for which purpose and in which context it's more useful to use the one or the other? Because for me, it's just not being an expert in affordability. I'm not an expert, just putting that forward. It's very confusing, and like I'm faced with so many different options, and I wouldn't know what to choose. So.
Sorry, guys, can we pass this? Because I think this
Yeah.
is an important question, and maybe we should.
Should we wait till the end?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we're deciding to get you an answer, but we'll do it after we've had the other two presentations, because it's a broader discussion. Yeah, thanks for raising it.
Okay, my name is Fred Wangila from GAIN. Thank you for the good presentation. My question is, why did you choose 17 as the lowest and 43 as the highest? And I know during COVID-19, there was a lot of dynamics in terms of changes. How did you address the confounding factors within that environment? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'm not sure I got the second question fully. Could you repeat?
Yes, so what I'm saying is that there are so many dynamics when at the time you're running the RCT. How did you feature them in your analysis so that you're able to clearly relate the changes because of the amount that you provided as cash transfer?
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's clear. Yeah, so the two cash transfer amounts were based off of, in part, the affordability analysis, but also kind of other considerations from the stakeholders. And my colleagues at SAFE could probably tell you more of the background of some of that back and forth. But ultimately, it was looking at kind of a lower level cash transfer that may be more scalable if it's proven to be effective, because obviously, it's cheaper, versus the higher level, the 43 was a much larger amount, kind of covering the full affordability gap plus other contexts. I don't know, Nat, if you wanted to add to anything that, Nat is my colleague that works on Maziko as a nutrition advisor.
To say that IFPRI is leading on the cluster randomized trial.
Come close to the mic, Natalie.
Yeah, the IFPRI is leading on the cluster randomized trial, so it would be better sort of suited to answer the confounding factors on the trial itself, no, it was, I think the lower cost transfer was both more affordable, but it was also to meet the maternal, it was focused on the maternal and child needs. And then the larger one was the household needs. The cash, the partner leading on the cash transfers is Give Directly. So we were trying also to sort of bring together poverty reduction, household needs kind of idea with maternal child cash transfer focused on the needs of the mother and what was affordable. So those were the sort of two dimensions.
Thank you. We'll go to Sabrina, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina. Thank you so much for joining us. I work with WFP. And I'm going to speak about the application of this cost and affordability metrics and the way we use them at WFP to inform different actions throughout policies and programs. So at WFP, we do an analysis that is called Fill the Nutrient Gap. I hope some of you have heard of it. We've done this analysis in over 40 countries. In some countries, we've even done it twice, depending on whether there's appetite, or we have done it to focus on a specific program and a specific vulnerable group. And this analysis is a stakeholder-led process. We really try to work with different stakeholders, not only in nutrition, but also outside of nutrition, so that we try to get the message out there, and maybe different people that are not as familiar with these type of messages also get to convene to think together and to see how they can act together for nutrition. One of the main components of this analysis is the use of cost and affordability metrics. Now, I think Rachel and Lily have done an excellent job in explaining this metric, so I'm not going to go through it again. But I will say that we normally focus on the first two, the energy-only diet and the nutrient-adequate diet. And we actually use the cost of diet tool developed by Save the Children, though now we maybe are in a bit of a transition process, but I'll talk about that a bit later. And we use these two diets because they allow us to look at individuals across the life cycle, so individuals of different age, individuals of different biological sex, and individuals of different reproductive status. Depending when Food Prices for Nutrition and FAO started monitoring the healthy diet basket, there was some appetite in countries where we do this analysis to also understand how these two metrics spoke to each other. So if that appetite exists, we can also calculate the healthy diet basket using the methodology from Food Prices for Nutrition. We then compare these metrics, very similar to what has already been presented, to household food expenditure. And those households that have an expenditure that falls below the cost of diet benchmark, then we consider them unable to afford. Those households that have food expenditure that falls above the cost of diet benchmark, then we consider them able to afford. And the reason why we use food expenditure is in those lower levels of income, those lower percentiles that you can see there, we assume, this is an assumption of the analysis, that households are spending as much as they can on food without having to implement any coping strategies. We know that maybe on the higher levels of income, this is different. People that have more income, of course, could probably spend more on food if they wanted to, but those are not the people that we're focusing on. We want to focus on the lower levels of income, and so that is the assumption that we make. And then we look, very similar to what Lily just explained, at interventions that can either reduce the cost of diet or increase expenditure on food. And again, very similar. We not only focus on affordability as a yes and no, but we look into the affordability gap. And this is maybe related to what was spoken at the plenary yesterday. Why we look at the affordability gap is because we want to understand the risk. If people have a really large affordability gap, then we think that they have a larger risk because their diets are probably lower quality. Now, we try to take different interventions from the toolbox and see what would be adequate in a specific context. And it's not that one intervention we expect will close the affordability gap, if that gap is too large, but we try to see what combination would make that gap be closed in the end, or what would bring them at least closer to that benchmark. We've also done some monitoring, especially in the past 2 years. Normally, the FNG is a bit of a snapshot of a specific point in time where we calculate cost, we calculate affordability. We sometimes have a seasonality component to it, so we calculate 2 points in time. But during COVID and during the global food crisis, where inflation kind of just surged in many places in the world, there was also an appetite to understand how costs had changed. And so this is an example from Ghana, as you can see there. We monitored throughout a year and a half how costs had changed, and we could see that, of course, costs had incremented very much, and we don't expect incomes to have changed this much. So, of course, this means that households have a higher risk of not having an adequate diet. As I mentioned, we use a nutrient-adequate diet because it allows us to see the vulnerabilities across the life cycle. We use a household of 5 people. One is an adult man, a breastfeeding woman, an adolescent girl, a school-aged child, 6 to 7 years old, and a baby, 2 to 3 years old. The baby, we assume, is breastfeeding. And we try to compare, we try to show this, especially this is something that we really try to emphasize with non-nutrition stakeholders, because maybe in this group it's not going to be that, surprising. But in certain non-nutrition groups, we always find people are very surprised to see the difference first, between an energy-only diet and a nutritious diet, a diet that meets those nutrient needs, but also the intra-household distribution of cost. So normally when we ask stakeholders to think, for example, how diets are distributed within their household, it looks more like the energy-only diet, if you take that distribution, not so much as a nutritious diet or as a nutrient-adequate diet. And so that starts getting people to think about the risk of malnutrition based on diets. And we do this analysis, on a country basis. We normally try to have disaggregation at a subnational level. Actually, all of the F&G analysis have disaggregation at a subnational level. Depending on the data, this disaggregation can be at the province level. We can do urban, rural. And the reason why we try to do this, and this is something that was emphasized also in the previous presentations, it's because there are great variations that we see. This is an example from Indonesia, where you can see that in certain provinces, the cost was almost a third of other provinces. And this is also related to affordability. And affordability is a combination of both high costs and purchasing power. So what does food expenditure look like? It's not necessary that the regions that have a higher cost will have a higher non-affordability of the diet. But it's a combination of two things. And so we try to compare these two things so to also get people thinking of where needs are higher. And as I said, we use these metrics to try to convene different stakeholders from different systems: food, agriculture, social protection, education. And with this life cycle approach, to try to understand what the different interventions could be that are applicable in that context, so to close that gap. And I'm going to show you a few examples from different countries. This is also from Indonesia. We compared different complementary feeding recipes and selected the one that raised the cost the least. This is, as has been explained, a least cost diet, a linear optimized diet. So any constraint that we set to the diet will, of course, elevate the cost. And so what we try to do when we see, for example, complementary feeding recipes is which one would be most cost effective in covering part of the cost, or not raising the cost, but covering those micronutrients. So which one would reduce the risk less at a lower cost for the household. And we also compare to certain products that are out there. In Indonesia, there was a concern over products that were called growing up milks. The name is pretty self-explanatory. They were targeted to children, but they have sugar content similar to soda. And these products were not regulated. And so what we try to show is we compared how this cost would elevate, even though these are pretty cheap, they are convenient, and that's also why people consume them. We try to compare these different products to a complementary feeding recipe, but also to products that were actually well formulated to meet the nutrition needs of this target group. So you can see the MPE-ASI. These three modeling examples, they cover approximately the same amount of calories, but you can see that the growing up milk, because it has so much sugar but so little nutrient content, then it elevated the cost so much because the rest of the food that the child has to consume has to be very nutritious dense. And that means that the cost of those foods are higher, meaning that there's probably a risk of that child, if these foods are consumed, to fall into malnutrition. Now, this is a bit of an alternative use of cost metrics. This was actually calculated using a PLUS tool. PLUS is a tool developed by WFP, the World Food Program, and this is a school meal planner tool, but it uses the same principle. So what we try to see here is what would be the minimum cash allocation per student in a school meal program to meet certain nutrient requirements. So you can see here, If you try to meet 20%, then you would need to allocate between 16 and 19. If you want to meet 30%, a bit more. If you want to meet 50% of micronutrients, then you have to increase that. And all of this is considering 550 calories. And so it's the amount, it's the density of, the nutrition density of foods that are included in this school meal. And that, of course, elevates the price. So this is just an alternative use of these cost metrics, so to showcase. Now, this is an example from Timor, and this is related to the distribution of the cost that I showed you. As you remember, the adolescent girl had really high costs, and it's the same analysis. And here, what we compared was supplementation with IFA and MMT. And we can see that MMT does a really, really good job in reducing the cost of the diet. MMT is provided at zero cost as part of a health system intervention. But you can see that it really reduces the cost, and how we interpret this is it really reduces the risk of malnutrition. And this is not the same, this might seem a bit obvious for some of you, but this is not the same in every country where we do the analysis. It depends on the food environment, because sometimes it's inverted. Sometimes IFA, because it has a higher iron content, actually does better in reducing the cost of the nutritious diet for an adolescent girl. It depends on what foods are available in that food environment. So this is very context specific. And we can also use these metrics to understand the adequacy of cash-based transfers. Kind of similar to what Lily presented, we compared the affordability gap in Nigeria and we looked at two transfers. And this is the affordability gap of the bottom 10% of the expenditure curve for households. We took the two transfers. As you can see, it's divided in two because there's a co-responsibility from the state governments. And we assume that 60%, based on expenditure patterns in the country, we assume that 60% is spent on food. And you can see that really it does not do a lot to cover that affordability gap. And it's not to advocate that transfer sizes are increased. I mean, it can be used for that, but we know that budgets are limited. It's to understand what sort of other interventions we can group together to try to close that affordability gap, bringing the sectors together and getting people thinking about what combination of interventions would work best in a specific context. So just to quickly talk about what's next for our team. We're looking into mainly two things. I think with this conference being about nutrition resilience, we have to recognize that both climate change is affecting nutrition outcomes, but also food systems is one of the main contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and to water usage. So what we're trying to see is look at the different objectives, not only nutrition, not only affordability, but also look at greenhouse gas emissions of diets and water usage of diets to try to understand how these different objectives interact with one another and what would be a possible win-win solution. What is the best possible solution, both for the planet and for the people? And we're trying to also incorporate considerations of current consumption, actual consumption, well, in a way, make our jobs easier, to try to see how we can deviate less from actual consumption when promoting different types of diets. I think this will make our jobs easier when promoting certain foods, etc. So just to conclude, really quickly, as I'm running out of time, least cost diet metrics provide an economic benchmark, and that can tell us, that can speak to the barriers to adequate nutrition, whether these are behavioral or economic barriers. We need to look at this evidence at the subnational level and through the life cycle to identify different vulnerabilities and the different risks to malnutrition, and to also be able to understand when, where, and what interventions are needed. And finally, these estimates of the impact of nutrition-specific, nutrition-sensitive interventions build on that evidence base on which interventions are fit to context and can help build nutrition resilience. So that's it from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. So especially some good examples on how we use these metrics to draw in the interest from other sectors in nutrition, being quantitative and showing with modeling how different foods that are available in the market, how they actually affect the cost and therefore the affordability and therefore the risk of nutritional deficiencies is a very good one. School meals is one where we frequently apply these metrics. Then supplements from the health sector, as Sabrina showed with the adolescent girl example. And also specifically for social protection, both how much can the cash transfer reduce the affordability gap, and then how additional interventions, basically because of their impact on lowering the cost of a nutritious diet, can reduce that gap further and therefore further lower the risk of malnutrition. And what's on the horizon for us is the enhanced software. Are there any clarifying questions? I've noted the question for Lily, but I'll do it after the last presentation. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. That's interesting presentation. But maybe just my opinion. I'm Hera from Ministry of Health in Indonesia. It's because very interesting study and tools too, and the result too. But I hope it's not only a building knowledge to us. I hope it also can be become a transfer knowledge and technology, and you have next planning, not stop until sharing knowledge, but you. I hope we prepare to have next plan to make it realize. Thank you.
Thank you. Sabrina, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is something that we're trying to do at WFP. We try to transfer the knowledge. When the government is interested, we can train the government in how to monitor this cost and affordability. It was done in one country, in EPHI, in Ethiopia, for EPHI, and they are monitoring cost and affordability of the nutrient adequate diet. So of course we're very open. We think this actually should happen at the country level, and we're very, very open to doing so. And we have a few projects upcoming that hopefully will, or that include that knowledge transfer component to the different countries.
Yeah, thank you. And you've seen also both from the food prices for nutrition, the Stata scripts are online. Save the Children has a tool online. So if you like, you can explore for yourself. There is different tools out there already, and we'll talk more about it after Florencia has spoken. Please.
Thanks very much. So as you can see, I am not Panjani. So, I don't know where my slides are.
Sorry. A weird version of my slides somehow.
It's the one at the very end. It says Panjani.
Oh no, you're going to go somewhere.
No, I think these are, it goes back around.
Now this is from the first presentation. You did upload them?
Yeah, I give them to Wendy.
Okay.
Sorry, this is the slide we got for this.
Did you add the slides to the, okay.
Can you go back to that screen where you chose the presentation?
He's,
So have you got 4 presentations there?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do one. Let's ask, respond to these questions while we go and check what's going on with this presentation.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the question that was asked on the different methods and which one to choose. So I can take a first step at that. So it really, there are different, when it comes ultimately to the calculations, you have to make a decision, which prices, which tool, etc. For explaining the results, it's not as complicated. So you've seen we really like to get non-nutritionists to understand that the cost of healthy, nutritious diets are considerably more costly than diets that just meet energy needs. And there's a big difference. You've seen the life cycle differences as well. The complementarity, they're really complementary, the nutrient adequate and the healthy diet. So Sabrina showed how the nutrient adequate diet, we can take into account different stages of the life cycle because they've all got different nutrient recommendations. For the healthy diet, it's typically recommendations for the population as a whole, and we use an indicator individual. That is an emphasis on diversity. The other one is an emphasis on meeting nutrient needs. It also means that you can then bring in fortified commodities. You can bring in supplements. So it's really looking at how can you gradually get to a lower cost and better affordability of diets that meet both diversity and nutrient needs. So on the side of the analyst, you have to understand what you're doing, what your questions are, and make these translation steps. So for interested people who are interested in the results, it's really on the analyst to do a good job and explain it properly. And in terms of which tools to use, there are a couple there, and yeah, you assess what you like to analyze and what your messages will then be. I don't know if anyone likes to add. Rachel?
Yeah, I think I can just add one small thing, which is that the cost of a healthy diet, I believe, is the only one that doesn't use linear optimization and was specifically designed to be easier to calculate. That is both a positive and a limitation, I think, depending on what question you want to answer, just like Saskia said. So I think what it does is just use rank ordering of least cost items. So it's, as actually you know well, it can be done in Excel and is sort of a simpler calculation that can be done more without statistical software that does the optimization. But yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities. And we did have a brief a long time ago to sort of describe, we actually, as we were preparing for the session, we were talking about updating the brief. So the point is noted, and thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Florentia, we hand over to you. Glad to see your presentation is up.
Nightmare. All right, so thanks everybody. So, and thank you for your patience. I'll be talking today about the case for large-scale food fortification. It's an intervention that's an important intervention and a good opportunity for contribution to diet and considering food affordability for resilience and food security. And so a lot of people in the room already know, but there was a recent Lancet Global Health article that aimed to update our estimates on the global burden of micronutrient deficiency. And it turns out that our estimates are actually worse than we originally thought. Nearly 4 billion people today have some sort of micronutrient deficiency, at least one or more key micronutrients. And so here you can see on this graph across the various regions, For children 6 to 59 months of age and non-pregnant women 15 to 49 years of age, you can see that nearly 2/3 in most regions have at least one micronutrient deficiency, and even in high-income countries, at least half of women and children have one or more micronutrient deficiencies. And so one tool in our toolbox of interventions to combat micronutrient deficiency is large-scale food fortification. So I'll go through a little bit of the context in case anybody isn't familiar with it. So large-scale food fortification is essentially the addition of small amounts of micronutrients, meaning vitamins and minerals, to foods at the stage of processing. So we rely on the food producers to add the micronutrients directly to their products. It targets widely consumed foods like staple foods, condiments, and so it has a potential to reach a large segment of the population without requiring a lot of behavior change. Standards and country minimums and maximums are context specific and also are guided by international standards. And countries can mandate food fortification through their legislation, meaning that all producers have to comply with fortification, or you can do this with voluntary programs. So today, more than 140 countries have either mandatory or voluntary fortification programs. And so here, this is from the Global Fortification Data Exchange, a map of legislation, mandatory or voluntary programs. And it only includes maize flour, oil, rice, salt, and wheat flour, although we know that there are more vehicles that are fortified, like sugar and margarine, for instance. And large-scale food fortification is just that. It's scalable. The UNICEF estimates that 88% of households globally have access to iodized salt. And this is one of the success stories in large-scale food fortification, which goes to show you the potential reach and coverage that fortification programs can have. And regarding the cost of implementing this, it's really very cost-effective, especially relative to other interventions. So the incremental cost per person per year is quite low at 4 cents for iodized salt and 10 cents for wheat and maize flour fortified with iron and folic acid. And in combination, the lifetime costs are less than 13 euros per person. And we also have evidence of the public health impact that large-scale food fortification programs can have. So a recent systematic review took together many different reviews of food fortification and found a 34% reduction in anemia from improved iron stores, 74% reduction in the odds of goiter and significant reduction in iodine deficiency, 41% decrease in the odds of neural tube defects, and a reduction in vitamin A deficiency among 3 million children, and significantly reducing their risk of mortality. And so as we've seen in the other presentations, healthy, diverse diets are often very expensive and still out of reach for many populations, especially the most vulnerable. According to the FAO, healthy diets are estimated to be, on average, 5 times more expensive than diets that meet only dietary energy needs through starchy staples. So one of my colleagues at GAIN, in collaboration with UNICEF, carried out a study where they looked at what are the different micronutrients that children aged 6 to 23 months are currently lacking in their diets, what are the best whole food sources to meet these dietary gaps, and then what's the affordability of these whole food sources. And so the figure here shows, well, first I'll start with the micronutrient deficiencies. Some of the main micronutrient deficiencies were iron, vitamin A, zinc, folate, and vitamin B12, as well as calcium. And the figure here shows the top food sources, whole food sources, for the micronutrients that these children were commonly lacking. And this is very consistent with some of the other work that we saw on the panel today. And essentially, what they saw was beef liver, chicken liver, small dried fish, beef, eggs, dark leafy greens are really the best sources of whole food for micronutrients that these children were commonly lacking. However, when you look at the cost of these nutritious foods and you compare it to some of the staple foods that are available, you can see that these are highly unaffordable when it comes to comparing them with the staples. So for instance, maize flour, compared to the whole food sources in these African countries, the best whole food sources were exponentially more expensive than maize flour. Likewise, in South Asia, you can see the same thing with the lowest cost staple, where all of these best whole food sources were exponentially more expensive. So then looking at the nutrient affordability across all of the countries, the rising analysis found that largely vitamin A, folate, and vitamin B12 were some of the most affordable micronutrients in this whole food sources. However, iron and zinc were largely unaffordable. And this analysis, however, did not include staple foods. And so when considering staples now, one can see that there is a potential to considerably improve intakes of micronutrients. And so here's an example of the work done by WFP in the Fill the Nutrient Gap, and where they're looking at the example of Kyrgyzstan and looking at the contribution that large-scale food fortification of wheat flour can have if they were to fortify to the national standard, and then the additional contribution one can have through the WHO guidelines. And so you can see really that this can have a potential impact for micronutrients, and in this example, particularly B1, B2, folic acid, zinc. Okay, so what about cost and affordability? So in theory, fortified foods should really not change the price for those foods that are available to the consumer. So what the consumer sees is really not that much of a price difference. And typically, you can see anywhere from maybe like 1% to 4% at a maximum. So if there's mandatory fortification, it's really leveling the playing field, so there shouldn't be a cost at the consumer level. So with this in mind, this example shows a modeling exercise for what a nutritious diet would cost for a household with an adult male, a pregnant or lactating woman, an adolescent girl, 6 to 7-year-old child, and a child younger than 2 who is still breastfeeding. And if you include fortification of staples at market price into this model, in this example, it's fortified wheat flour and oil in Ghana. Fortified foods actually, on average, make it more affordable for the people in this household to get a nutritious diet. So again, fortified foods, when they're introduced into the model at market cost, the overall cost of the diet for the household decreased substantially. And this can be especially important, as we've seen before in the other presentations. You're looking at COVID, conflict, climate issues, which really create stressors on people's ability to purchase foods and their food choices. So this is an example in Addis in Ethiopia, where they're looking at the household consumption in September of 2019 before COVID, and then at the height of COVID in August 2020. And so this looks at the percent difference in calories, and you can see a significant difference in the purchase of calories coming from staples. This increased by 23% at the height of COVID. And then you can see the decrease in legumes and nuts, and especially vegetables. And like we saw in the rising analysis, legumes and nuts or pulses and dark green leafy vegetables were those more affordable sources of things like iron and zinc. And so you can see, like in crisis, we see this a lot in other examples, but the pattern is typically moving from more fresh foods to more staple foods for dietary intake. And so the point I wanted to make with this slide and the last slide is really that when you're moving from unfortified foods to fortified foods, you're really not changing the cost. And it's especially in times of crisis, where more people are relying on staple foods and they're shifting away from these perishable fresh foods, fortified foods in the context of food security remain even more important and affordable sources of micronutrients. And so, like many other interventions, fortification does have its challenges. And this is data from the large set of fact surveys. And it demonstrates that you can have various challenges, especially in coverage and quality. So I just wanted to mention a few of these. One is the use gap, where you can see this red dotted line. This is the percentage of households who are consuming that staple food which is fortified. And so where this gap is large, we typically have sort of assumed that more people are consuming the staple food we had planned. So maybe a different vehicle or additional vehicles to be fortified could be added. The feasibility gap here is the difference between those that are consuming that staple food and those that are consuming a fortifiable staple version of that staple food. So where this gap is large, you often see more artisanal producers or more home production of that type of food. So it's not really fortifiable. And then the fortification gap here is the difference between the fortifiable and what is actually fortified in the country. And so there, it's really, if you have a large gap there, it's really non-adherence to fortification. And finally, the quality gap, which we see often in fortification, is where if you don't have the fortified food to the standard established at the country level, you won't have the public health impact intended. And so where this gap is large, you could strengthen monitoring. And so again, fortification is one tool in our toolbox of ways to address micronutrient deficiency, and it represents an important contribution and in an affordable way. But it can and oftentimes should be complemented with things like dietary diversification and supplementation where deficiencies are more severe. And so given that this conference is about nutrition for resilience, I wanted to use this quote, food system resilience is the capacity over time of a food system and its units at multiple levels to provide sufficient, appropriate, and accessible foods to all in the face of various and unforeseen disturbances. And so food fortification is a way to help lay the groundwork for a minimum micronutrient supply, and it needs to be in place before these crises happen. So as we see more reliance on staple foods, and they really tend to be more accessible and more affordable in most contexts, especially for the most vulnerable. So in summary, food fortification is an important intervention for strengthening population resilience, and it contributes to improved diet quality in an affordable way. For some population groups, it may not fill 100% of the nutrient needs, with the exception of salt. As many of you know, it can be close to 100% of contributing to people's intakes for iodine. So in most cases, it should be complemented with other micronutrient interventions. And finally, improved implementation, the example I showed, addressing the gaps in coverage and quality, increased awareness, especially by government and producers, can help strengthen its intended public health impact. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think that was a nice case to see how the cost and affordability also comes into the story on fortification. Very clear seeing the need for fortification because the diets are too expensive and the nutrient-dense foods are costly, which you clearly showed with the Risset and Conga analysis. And then it really comes to who are being covered and could we pool fortified foods to those who are most in need. So yeah, thank you very much for that example. Any clarifying questions from the floor or any other questions or comments? We're now opening it for any comments. And I've got one online, so while you think of your question, and please come to the microphone. There's a question for Save the Children. From our colleague, WSP colleague from West Africa. So WSP is working in Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso to analyze seasonal impact of non-affordability of nutritious diets. How is the work that you presented related to this analysis now that SILS has endorsed cost and affordability as an indicator of food security?
Yeah, great. So the work that we presented in Niger was just a small-scale pilot, kind of using some resources internally that we had, but great that that kind of cost and affordability is being looked at more broadly. And I know that there's a lot of kind of regional initiatives, both with costs of the diet and cost analysis, but also around livelihoods through the cadre harmonisé and all of these within West Central Africa. So I think bringing the two together is also really important to understand the livelihoods aspects as well as the cost and affordability.
Yeah, thank you. And you're also speaking with sales.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Nice. Yeah, please.
I'm Gabrielle, Nutrition and Health Master Student at Wageningen University. I'm wondering, with food fortification, if we're starting to fortify more and more staple crops, whether we're kind of moving away from the focus on dietary diversification.
Great question. No, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Like I mentioned, it's a complement to other interventions that occur. So we know, given all of these presentations today, that mostly, for most people, healthy, diverse diets are still unaffordable. And so in the meantime, while we're still trying to increase dietary diversification, all of that, we want to make sure that people are still getting the micronutrients that they need to fill their diets. So large-scale food fortification, we know that they're consuming those staple foods, especially in times of crisis and especially among the most vulnerable. That provides a good vehicle to provide these micronutrients. At the same time, we need to really strengthen the food system and its ability to deliver micronutrients through whole foods, but it should complement.
But it's not a temporary solution, right? It's something that will stick in the long run.
Sorry?
It's something that will stay there in the long run. If you start with the food fortification, it's unlikely to.
Well, for some staples, yes. It needs to be monitored over time to make sure that, in conjunction with our understanding of the dietary gaps in the population, that there is still that safety net. It's a contribution to the diet. It's not going to fill the entire nutrient gap or dietary gap or needs for the population. But especially for the most vulnerable, it helps to fill and create that safety net.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can add something there as well. I mean, doing these analyses in many low middle income countries, and for example, talking about the cost of a school meal, a diverse school meal, many governments say, that's not affordable at the moment. And meanwhile, we do put micronutrient content targets. So like Sabrina's example, where you saw the meeting 20%, 30% or 50% of micronutrient needs. If you then introduce a fortified food, then it becomes more affordable to at least meet the nutrient needs. And of course, we know the consequences of micronutrient deficiencies. So while we get to diets becoming more diverse and more affordable, we definitely want to make sure that on that ladder we make the steps that are within economic reach.
Hi, Charlotte Peterson from GAIN also. Maybe just a comment. We did also see that also in the high income countries that we still have deficiencies. So I do also believe that for some micronutrients, actually, if we want it, it is not available in the diet. Is that correct to say? With iodine, for example, also sometimes iron, and in the Nordics, vitamin D, it's not possible really to get from your diet. So supplements in some form still be needed?
Right. So for many people, salt iodization does contribute most of people's intakes because they just simply don't have access to sources of iodine in their regular diets. So table salt does provide nearly 100% of people's intakes of iodine. For high-income countries, the most recent Lancet Global Health Review that I shared, it was surprising that so many people in even high-income countries had a micronutrient burden of at least one micronutrient, or micronutrient deficiency in at least one or more micronutrients. So the issue there is it's sometimes two sides of the same coin. So for the cause usually for the low and middle income countries tends to be that people rely on energy, high energy but micronutrient poor staple foods in their diets. Whereas in high income countries, there tends to be a reliance on ultra processed micronutrient poor foods as well. So you are seeing, even though you have higher rates of perhaps, obesity and things like that, you still have a micronutrient poor diet because the quality of the diet is low in both sides. So you are seeing these gaps. Sorry, I don't know if I wanted...
Thanks, Valencia.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Would you like? Yeah. No. Would you like to ask a question to any of the panelists? Yeah. Okay. Okay. The respected time. It's almost the last session of the day. There's one plenary session right after this, or almost in half an hour at 5:30. So I'd like to thank the audience for your attention, for your contributions, and we hope that you see the value of these metrics and that you will look into how they can be used in the countries or the agencies that you work with. To have a much better handle on food security and nutrition, and on predictions of where we expect deficiencies and where, through monitoring, where this is headed. So thank you very much, and thanks to all the presenters.